Okay, so last time we worked on simplifying radicals, we worked on simplifying square roots and cube roots, and even if they have negatives in them. So let's review that for a few minutes, and then we will get into the new material. Okay, so let's simplify the problem. The square root of negative 56 x to the 5th, y to the 9th. Okay, so remember you're supposed to break down 56. So 56 is 7 times 8. The 7 is prime, but 8 breaks down into 4 times 2. The 4 breaks down into 2 times 2. Okay, so we're going to go back in and write it in our square root as -1 times, there's 3 2's and 1 7. And then you could write out 5 x's and 9 y's, or you could just kind of think about it as you go through it. Okay, so to come out here at square root, so I need pairs of numbers. The -1 always comes out. How does the -1 come out in this case? As an I, because it's square root, so it needs to come out as an I. I can take out 2 2's. So what number is going to be on the outside? 2i, right? I'm going to leave some space for my letters. On the inside of my square root, what number is left over? 2 and 7, so that would be 14. For the x to the 5th and the y to the 9th, x to the 5th, if I have 5 x's, how many groups of 2 can I get out of that? 2 groups of 2, so it's going to be x squared on the outside. Do you have any x's left over? There's 1 x left over. If I have 9 y's, how many groups of 2 can I get out of 9 y's? 4 groups of 2. And how many are left over? Just 1 is left over. And that is your answer. Okay, let's do another one of those. What about if it was the square root of -175x to the 11th? You do that one. Okay, so, sorry, that's up to 11th power. Yes, thank you, Sabrina. So if I want to break that down, 175 is 25 times 7, or you could do 5 times 35, like however you got there, right? 7's prime, but 25 is 5 times 5. So I'm going to rewrite this as the square root of -1 times 5 times 5 times 7, and then x to the 11th power. So I can take out, how do you take out a -1? As an I. I can take out a pair of 5s. So on the outside, I'm going to have 5i. We'll leave space. On the inside, I would have 7. This x to the 11th, if I had 11 x's written out, how many groups of 2 could I take out? 5 groups of 2. So x to the 5th on the inside. Do you have any left over? 1x left over. So 1's on the inside. And that's your answer. Questions about that? Okay, what about this one? What about the cube root now of -250x to the 5th? So when you break down 250, you should get 3 5s and a 2, right? And then it's going to be -1 times 2 times 3 5s. And then 5 x's, or you can just write x to the 5th. For cube root, how does a negative come out on a cube root? It's just a negative, right? You just pull out a negative, so it's going to be a -1 on the outside. I can circle groups of 3 this time. So I have 3 5s I can take out. So on the outside, it's going to be -5 times, oh, I should have left a little bit of space. Let me just start over. -5. I'm gonna leave a little bit of space. Cube root of what number's left on the inside? 2. If I have 5 x's, how many groups of 3 can I take out? 1. And how many are left over? 2 x's. So x squared is going to be on the inside. And that's my answer. Questions about that? Okay, so that's what we spent our whole week on basically at this point. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get into section 8.1. 8.1 is solving square roots, or solving quadratics by using square roots. Okay, so I'm gonna call it solving by using square roots. Okay, we are starting to get into quadratics and talking about quadratics. Okay, what is a quadratic? Anybody have an idea? A quadratic is any equation that has an x squared in it. So usually we see it as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So a quadratic is anything that has a square in it, or that the highest exponent is a square. How about that? Okay, when we solve quadratics, this highest exponent, we'll learn this in a little bit, this highest exponent is actually the degree, and that tells you how many answers there are. So every quadratic has 2 answers. They might be the same number, they might be different numbers, they may be pretty numbers, and they may be ugly numbers. It just kind of depends on the problem. So every quadratic has 2 answers for it. Okay, when we go to solve a quadratic, there are 5 different ways to solve a quadratic. So far, we've learned one way. What's the one way we've learned to solve a quadratic? Yes, but we haven't learned that actually. That's next Monday's lesson. Okay, so in here, on your last exam, it was the last problem on the back of your test. You had to factor it and then set your factors equal to 0 and solve, right? So that's one way, is solving by factoring. Okay, so solving by factoring is a great way to solve. It's actually probably the easiest way to solve quadratics. The only problem is, does every single problem factor? No. Okay, so that's the issue here, is this only works like 80% of the time. Only about 80% of your problems factor, so I can't just use that as my only way to solve. We still include it because it's quick and it's pretty easy, pretty painless, depending on the problem. If it's an AC method problem where A isn't 1, sometimes it might take a little bit longer, but you could probably argue that's still faster than using the quadratic formula. Okay, so we love to factor. No, out of all of our options, this is probably our favorite option for solving quadratics. Okay, we have 2 others that we're going to learn today. We're not going to finish up the third one. The second way is, well, this is the one we're getting to at the end of class today, is quadratic formula. Okay, the quadratic formula is that super long negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Is that fast? No. Is it fun? I don't think it's fun, and I like math. So quadratic formula is just tedious and long. Guess how often it will work though? Every single time, no matter what. It works 100% of the time. Okay, so you may argue, like, why would we do anything except for quadratic formula? Because it's no fun and it takes a lot of time to do. So quadratic formula is a good tool to have because it always, always, always works. It's just not very fast and efficient. So that's why we have factoring and the other ones we're going to talk about. The third one we're going to talk about is solving using square roots. This is by far our fastest way of solving, but there are some conditions to be able to use it. Okay, so because there's so many conditions, it doesn't happen very often. I'd say like maybe 25% of the time. Okay, so there are 2 more ways. We're not going to get to those now. We're going to pause on that and we're going to move on. In your college algebra class, you are going to review how to solve quadratics, and they're going to go over these 3 ways. For my class, it's on Monday. If the Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, you'll be doing it on Monday probably. Otherwise, it's coming up this next week. So hopefully this will be a good introduction for college algebra next week. Okay, so let's talk about square roots. So if I had the problem x squared equals 9. I'm actually going to solve that 2 different ways. So I'm going to write that problem twice because I'm going to do it 2 different times. So x squared equals 9. What's one way to solve that problem? Yeah, to undo the square. How do you undo the square? You take the square root of both sides. What is the square root of x squared? Just x. The square and square root undo each other. They're inverse operations. Okay, so I'm just left with x on the left-hand side. What is the square root of 9? 3. Okay, that's a quadratic. It's supposed to have how many answers? 2 answers. How many answers did I get here? Just one. Sometimes you get an answer, one answer that's an answer twice, called a multiplicity, and you will get into that after exam number 1 in college algebra. Let's look over here at this one. Same problem. I'm going to solve this a different way. I want to solve this one by factoring. To solve it by factoring, it has to equal 0. How am I going to make this equal 0? Yeah, I'm going to subtract 9 just so that it'll be a little nicer looking. So I'm going to subtract 9 from both sides, and so I get x squared minus 9 equals 0. And then I want to solve that by factoring now. How do I factor that? It doesn't have a GCF. It has 2 terms. So it's either squares or cubes. Which one is this? Squares. So we factor it as 2 sets of parentheses. One has a plus sign, the other has a minus sign. And then you take the square root of everything. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 9 is 3. And now how do I solve that? Set them both equal to 0 and solve. So x plus 3 equals 0. X minus 3 equals 0. Subtract 3 on the first one. I get x equals negative 3. Add 3 on the second one. I get x equals positive 3. How many answers did I get over here? 2 different answers, okay? There are 2 answers for this. One of them is positive 3, one of them is negative 3. Let's plug it back in to make sure it works. When I plug in positive 3, is positive 3 squared equal to 9? When I plug in negative 3, is negative 3 squared equal to 9? Yeah, because negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Because of this, we have this rule for solving using square roots. Did I start off with the square root in my problem? Did you start off with this radical in your problem? No, you did not start off. It just was x squared minus 9. We used a radical to solve it. So there is a rule that says if you use a square root to solve, then you must use plus or minus. And I'll explain what that just means in just a second. So just write it down first. So if you didn't, your problem didn't start off with a radical, you put a radical in there to solve it, then you have to put a plus or minus on your answer. So what I do is when I write that radical, right over here on this side, I put plus or minus in front of it so that I remember. You don't have to do it on the left-hand side because the radical goes away. You only have to do it on the right-hand side. So my answer for this is plus or minus 3. And again, the plus or minus thing, that's like 2 different answers. That's like positive 3 or negative 3. Okay, so that's how you get your 2 answers using the square root. Which one's faster in this case, square root or solving by factoring? Square root if you can remember the plus or minus, because you got to get both of the answers. Okay. Okay, so let's do a few of these. I have the problem. Let's start off pretty easy. Let's start off with, let's do another easy one just like that. X squared equals 49. So to solve that using square roots, I get the x by itself. I take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. Okay, so I get the square root of x squared. Those undo each other, and I'm just left with x is plus or minus the square root of 49. What's the square root of 49? 7. So it's plus or minus 7. Math Excel will want you to write 2 answers. What are my 2 answers there? Positive 7 and negative 7. Okay, we're just going to practice writing that just so that you understand that's 2 answers. What about if it was x squared minus 6 equals 30? Okay, how am I going to solve for x here? You have to add 6 first before you take the square root. So when I add 6, I get x squared equals 36. How do I solve for x now? Take the square root. Don't forget your plus or minus. So the square root and the square undo each other. What is the square root of 36? 6. So it's plus or minus 6, which, what two answers is that? Positive 6 and negative 6. Questions about that? Hey, what about if it was x squared minus 8 equals 42? First thing you do is add 8 to both sides. And I get x squared equals 50. Now I take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. Can I take the square root of 50? Not pretty, right? It's a big old decimal. So this is why we've just learned that. Let's simplify it. So 50 breaks down into 2 times 25. 25 breaks down into 5 times 5. So this would be the square root of x squared is just x, is plus or minus the square root of 2 times 5 times 5. What can you pull out? A pair of 5s. That pair of 5s goes, like the plus or minus goes first, so it's going to go in between the plus or minus and the square root sign. So your answer is going to be plus or minus 5 times the square root of 2. So we're putting together all the things that we've been learning. What's my two answers there? Positive 5 square root of 2 and negative 5 square root of 2. Questions about that? Okay, let's do another one. What about if I had 3x squared plus 5 equals, give me a second, 100 and, let's do 104. That's my first step to solve for x here. Subtract 5 from both sides. I get 3x squared equals 99. How do I solve for x? Yeah, you gotta divide by 3 first. You can't square root it because if I square root this side, I have the square root of 3x squared, and I can't do the square root of 3, and it's a big old mess. So divide by 3 first. So I get x squared equals 99 divided by 3 is 33. How do I solve for x now? Square root, don't forget your plus or minus. So the square root of x squared is just x equals plus or minus. Can I take the square root of 33? No, if I break 33 down, what two numbers do I get? 3 times 11, can I pull anything out there? Nope, so it's just the square root of 33, and that's your answer. Questions about that? Okay, let's do another one. If I had x squared plus 64 equals 0. Elizabeth, I got you. It's here. Okay, how do I solve for x here? Subtract 64 from both sides, and I get x squared equals negative 64. How do I solve for x? Square root, don't forget your plus or minus. So the square root of x squared is just x equals plus or minus, what's the square root of negative 64? 8i, right? The negative comes out as an I, the square root of 64 is 8, so it's plus or minus 8i. What are my two answers there? 8i and negative 8i. I forgot to do on the last one. What's the two answers on the last one of plus or minus the square root of 33? Yep, square root of 33 and negative square root of 33. Okay, questions about that? Let's get another one. Mm, 2x squared plus 100 equals 0. What's my first step to solve for x here? Subtract 100 from both sides. I get 2x squared equals negative 100. How do I solve for x? Divide both sides by 2. So I get x squared equals negative 100 divided by 2, negative 50. And then to solve for x, take the square root of both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. So I get x equals plus or minus. So 50 breaks down into 2 times 5 times 5. Right? So this is like under the square root, it's like negative 1 times 2 times 5 times 5. What's going to come out? The 5 and the negative 1. So what's going to be on the outside? 5i times the square root of what's left over? 2. What are my two answers there? 5i square root of 2 and negative 5i square root of 2. Questions about that? Okay, so those problems are not super long. I mean, they take a little bit of time, but it's not terrible. It's not as bad as quadratic formula, that's for sure. All of these problems have something in common. Because remember I said there was restrictions. We can only use it certain times. So look at the first problem. X squared, 49. X squared, and I had an 8 and a 42. X squared, 6, 30. 3x squared, 5, 104. X squared, 64, 0. What do they all have in common? They all just have the x squared. Do any of them have a regular old x? No. So, go back to the first page. The only time we can use square roots is whenever my quadratic doesn't have that bx term. Okay, so we can only use this when b equals 0 or no x term, however you want to think about it. So we can only use square roots when I just have an x squared and a number. If the problem was x squared plus 5x plus 2 or whatever, you cannot solve it using square roots. The x messes everything up. Okay, so anytime you don't have that middle term, square roots is a fantastic way to solve it. Okay, let me show you one other thing. Sometimes these square root problems look a little tiny bit different because they have parentheses, so let's do just one or two of those. If I had x plus 3 squared equals, let's start off with just like 36. I said one or two, we're gonna do a couple of these. Okay, notice I had x plus 3 inside the parentheses, the squared on the outside. This time I have to get rid of the squared first. So the first thing you have to do is take the square root of both sides, and don't forget your plus or minus. So what's the square root of the left-hand side of the x plus 3 squared? Yeah, it's just x plus 3. The squared and square root still just undo each other, and so I'm just left with x plus 3. equals plus or minus, what's the square root of 36? 6. How do I solve for x now? Subtract 3 from both sides. So it's like I get x equals, so this plus or minus 6, that's two different answers, right? This is positive 6 and negative 6. I have to subtract 3 from both of them. What is positive 6 minus 3? 3. What's negative 6 minus 3? Negative 9. Okay, so that's my two different answers, 3 and negative 9. Does that make sense? So it's like I have to put the plus or minus in a little bit earlier than before, so it kind of makes me have two problems as I work it out. Not always, but when you can take the square root, you do. Let's do two more like that. What about if it was x minus 4 squared equals 41? What's my first step here? I still take the square root first. Don't forget your plus or minus. So the square root and square undo each other. I'm left with x minus 4. Can you take the square root of 41? Can you break down 41? I think it's a prime number, so I think that's it, just the square root of 41. So this time when I go to solve for x, how do I solve for x now? Add 4. And that 4 goes up in front of that plus or minus sign. So you put the 4 first before the plus or minus sign. So your answer is going to be x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 41. What are your two answers there? 4 plus the square root of 41 and 4 minus the square root of 41. Questions about that? Okay, one more of those. What about if it was 3x minus 1 squared equals negative 7? What's the first thing we have to do? Square root both sides. Don't forget your plus or minus. So now on the left-hand side, the square and the square root, they undo each other. So I'm left with 3x minus 1. On the right-hand side, plus or minus the square root of negative 7. How can I simplify that? Take out the negative, right? 7 doesn't break down, it's a prime number, but I can take out the negative as an I. So it's going to be plus or minus I times the square root of 7. Now how am I going to solve for x? Add 1. The 1 goes up in front of the plus or minus sign. So I get 3x equals 1 plus or minus I times the square root of 7. And now how do I solve for x? Divide both sides by 3. So I get x equals 1 plus or minus I times the square root of 7 divided by 3. That should look a little bit familiar. What does that kind of look like? Yeah, if you solved using the quadratic formula, that's kind of how your answers usually turn out. What are my two answers there? There you go. 1 plus I times the square root of 7 divided by 3, and 1 minus I times the square root of 7 divided by 3. Okay, questions about that at all? Okay, so let's take about 5 more minutes and talk about the quadratic formula now. So this is section 8.2, which is the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. All of it, even the negative b at the beginning, is divided by 2a. Okay, quadratic formula is a way to solve any quadratic ever. It will give you the answer every single time. It may not be the fastest way to do it, but it for sure will work every single time. So these a, b's, and c's, remember they come from your problem of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if your problem doesn't equal 0, you need to make it equal 0 so that you can find a, b, and c. Just a reminder, you never plug any kind of x into your quadratic formula. You're always just plugging in numbers. Okay, so for example, if your quadratic was like x squared plus 5x plus 7, what's the a value here? A is 1, the number in front of x squared. What's the b value here? 5, and c value is 7. Okay, so I guess let's make that our first problem that we're going to do. X squared plus 5x plus 7 equals 0. We already got that a is 1, b is 5, c is 7. So we're going to plug those into your formula. So I get x equals negative b. That means change the sign of whatever your b value is. So if b was positive 5 here, when I put it in this part, it's going to be negative 5. That's the only place we change the sign of it, though. Okay, now it's plus or minus the square root of b squared. So I'm just using my regular b value now, not the negative one. So in parentheses, I'm going to put 5 and square it. Minus 4 times a. What's my a value? 1. What's my c value? 7. All divided by, even the negative 5 at the beginning is divided by this. 2 times, what's my a value? 1. Okay, one of the biggest mistakes on this problem is this step right here, figuring out that part under the square root sign. Okay, so when you do it, 5 squared, what is 5 squared? 25. When you figure out this right here, use that minus sign as a negative. The minus sign is what messes everybody up. Okay, don't think of that as a minus sign. Think of that as negative 4 times 1 times 7. What's negative 4 times 1 times 7? Negative 28. Okay, so if it's a negative 28, I'm going to subtract 28. If it was a positive 28, I would add it. Okay, so that minus sign, don't think of it as subtract, think of it as negative 4, and if your answer comes out negative, then you subtract it. You could also use your calculator on this part if this is the part that is really big numbers, or you have a hard time coming up with it, or you always mess with the negative. Just don't put the square root in your calculator. Just do the 5 squared. So 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 7. If you just type it in exactly like that, it should give you your answer of negative 3. Okay, so that number you find, that's the part that goes in the square root. So this now is negative 5 still, plus or minus the square root of, we figured out that was negative 3 inside, all divided by 2 times 1. What's 2 times 1? 2. And then we simplify the square root. The square root of negative 3, how do I simplify that? Take out an I. I can't break down 3 to anything, so I just have to take out the I. So I get negative 5 plus or minus I times the square root of 3 divided by 2 as my answer. That's 2 answers there. What's one of the answers? Negative 5 plus I squared root of 3 divided by 2. What's the other one? Negative 5 minus I squared root of 3 divided by 2. Okay, so this is how Math Lab will want you to put your answers in. Okay, so there's 3 mistakes that usually happen on this problem. One mistake is not putting a in as 1, putting like x squared in. It gets really ugly if you try to put x's in there. So always just try to put numbers in there. The second mistake is messing up the number on the inside of the square root. We're going to spend more time next Monday doing a lot more of these problems, practicing that part. The last mistake is lots of people sometimes write their answer like this: negative 5 plus or minus I times the square root of 3 divided by 2. Do you see the difference between these two? This is wrong. You will get this wrong every single time. The 5 at the beginning, the negative 5 at the beginning, also has to be divided by 2. So make sure you put your division sign all the way across it. Okay. Okay, we will do more of these on Monday. You have math homework due next Monday, so make sure you're working on your Math Lab homework and staying caught up on that. And I will see y'all on Monday.